The impact of historical events on men and women in the 1910s. Life as a man in 1910s America. The early 20th century was a time of profound social, economic, and political upheaval in the United States, and the events of the 1910s had a significant impact on the lives of both men and women. For this video, we'll explore what life as a man was like in the 1910s, and in part 2 of this series, we'll focus on women's lives during this decade. At the beginning of the 1910s, America was a country made up of 47 states containing a little over 95 million residents, with roughly 47 million of those being male. The most populous states were New York, Pennsylvania, and Illinois. For the average adult man in the 1910s, your name was John, William, or James, and you were 5'8". You may have been one out of the 3 people who owned a horse, or, if you were fortunate, one of the 18 out of 1,000 who owned a car. At the beginning of the decade, the majority of the workforce was male, and the average U.S. wage was 22 cents per hour. Most workers earned between $200 and $400 per year, while a competent accountant could expect to earn $2,000 per year, a veterinarian between $1,500 and $4,000 per year, and a mechanical engineer made around $5,000 per year. Unfortunately, the societal norms that are documented did not extend to African American men or most other minorities at this point in American history. Although the experience of minorities during this time varied due to differing racial attitudes between the regions, minorities were still largely undervalued. In 1910, the legal age to marry in the United States was 14 years old. The census of 1910 shows that of the population of men 15 years and older, 55.8% of them were married, 4.5% were widowed, and just 0.5% were divorced. The country was much more religious, and it wasn't as easy to get a divorce as it is today. The early 20th century marked a significant shift in the way that Americans approached dating and courtship. The traditional model of arranged marriages and strict gender roles was slowly giving way to a more modern, individualistic approach to romance and relationships. As a man, you were still viewed as in charge, though. As you left for a date in your dapper suit, you had already initiated and orchestrated the upcoming social engagement. You were also undoubtedly responsible to pick up the tab. In the 1910s, the concept of dating, as we understand it today, began to emerge. Young people, particularly in urban areas, started to engage in more casual public forms of interaction, such as attending movies, going to dance halls, or taking walks in the park. This represented a departure from the more formal, supervised interactions or courtship that had previously been the norm. However, the ideal of the chaperone remained an important aspect of dating, with young women expected to be accompanied by a parent or trusted adult when meeting with a romantic interest. This was seen as a way to maintain and protect the virtue of young women. The concept of someone being the one wasn't marketed heavily to Americans until later in the century, and purity was paramount, so the dating process, as you can imagine, was a fairly quick one. Not only was dating simplified, but so were engagements and weddings. We had yet to commercialize the love industry in the US, and weddings were small, intimate affairs. You and your new wife would either wed and continue to live in a multi-generational home, or move to the cities and made the shift to single-family living, a drastic shift in familial structure that happened during this decade in America. If you were a typical household, you were the father to 2 to 3 children and were viewed as the head over the family. With war looming and the suffragists marching, these gender roles would soon be questioned, though. Women didn't get the right to vote nationally until 1920, but men had a political predicament on their hands in the election of 1912. While women could vote in certain state elections during this time period, the turnout among men for the federal election of 1912 was 59% of the electorate, with just over 15 million votes cast. As men fled to the polls and stepped toward the box or a fancier voting apparatus like this one, the situation frustrated many of them. Former President Teddy Roosevelt, feeling betrayed by the current president, William Taft, left the Republican Party to become the nominee of the Progressive Party, the first serious challenger to the two-party system in many years. He and Socialist Party candidate Eugene Debs helped take votes from Taft, which in turn led to the election of Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson, a champion of progressive political reforms. Wilson went on to lead government efforts to reform the federal banking system, regulate large businesses, provide aid to farmers, and enact a progressive income tax. While Wilson is largely known for being a wartime president and one of the most progressive politicians our country has ever elected, he ended up being one of the most regressive in our nation's history when it comes to race. When Wilson entered office in 1913, he was the first Southerner and only the second Democrat to be president since Reconstruction. His cabinet included several white Southerners who had no idea how integrated the federal service had become. Although he had made promises to the black church on the campaign trail that he would treat them fairly in regards to race, he made the decision to resegregate whites from blacks in federal service and was a strong supporter of the KKK. One of the most significant events of the decade was the outbreak of World War I in 1914. The United States' entry into the conflict in 1917 resulted in the conscription of millions of American men who were drafted into military service and sent to the battlefields of Europe. This experience had a profound impact on the psyche of an entire generation of men as they were forced to confront the realities of modern warfare and the trauma of combat. While America didn't enter the war immediately, we were supporting the war efforts, which gave way to a booming economy. While the Industrial Revolution led to more densely populated cities, World War I further highlighted the changing manufacturing landscape and a migration to cities away from rural America. From 1900 to 1914, only 1% of the United States' gross national product was spent on defense. Now, however, priorities changed. There was a need to create a powerful defense and offense by building up the arms and munitions industry. By the war's end, America's war expenses would total $17.1 billion for the development of wartime military force. Throughout the early years of World War I, there was a heavy anti-war, isolationist sentiment from both the general public and the White House, and there had never been a draft or selective service requirement enacted in our nation's history. As the war progressed, this proposition of service weighed on fighting-age men and their families alike. And in May of 1915, a little over a year since the war broke out, the Germans sunk the British passenger liner Lusitania, killing 1,198 people, including 128 Americans. This tragedy didn't cause the United States to enter the war, but did turn the heart of the largely neutral American against the Germans, setting the stage for our entrance just a few years later. In 1916, while men on the other side of the world fought for their lives, men in America prepared to vote again. This time, the third-party predicament wasn't the issue. It was the war and who would keep us out of it. While Republicans presented a formidable opponent to Wilson, former New York Governor and Supreme Court Justice Charles Evans Hughes, President Wilson narrowly defeated him. Although President Woodrow Wilson had promised in November of 1916 to keep us out of war, that promise faded into oblivion when Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare in February of 1917. The everyday American man was working hard to support their families and America's booming economy, while deep in the halls of Congress, men were getting ready to agree to our involvement. Submarine warfare was devastating, and the Zimmermann telegram, which was intercepted by the British, revealed German promises to give U.S. territory to Mexico. So just a month after President Wilson's inauguration, he called for a joint session of Congress on April 2nd, where he asked for a declaration of war. 2 days later, the Senate agreed 82-6, and on April 6, the House of Representatives voted in favor of war 373-50. The United States had made its decision, and on May 18, 1917, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, which authorized the federal government to temporarily expand the military through conscription, the first time in our nation's history that men would be required by law to fight for their country. The law authorized a draft of men between the ages of 21 and 31. While black men wanted to fight for the United States, Congress made this difficult for them, often insisting on a segregated fighting force. This led to many African American men taking the jobs in cities left behind by white men who had been drafted. This shift of black families from the South to northern cities during World War I is what we now call the Great Migration. This gave some upward mobility to minorities, but when the war ended with the armistice signed between the Axis and Allies on November 11, 1918, the homecoming of our great men would cause revolt within our own economy. Although these were turbulent times for American men, great inventions in social change were championed. The great inventions of the 1910s range from the simple opening pitch started by President Taft in 1910 to Henry Ford's assembly line, Fred Wolf's household refrigerator, and the incredibly popular crossword puzzle invented by journalist Arthur Wynne. These phenomenons and others of that decade have stood the test of time and remain popular in American life today. Of the social change championed by those in power, which was all men at this time, the women's suffrage movement was the most successful, with women gaining the right to vote nationally by 1920. Without the support of Republican men in particular, this would not have been possible. On May 21, 1919, an Illinois Republican by the name of James Mann reintroduced the 19th Amendment in the House of Representatives, and it passed by a vote of 304 to 89. In all, over 200 Republicans voted in favor of the 19th Amendment, while 102 Democrats voted alongside of them. By the next month, the 19th Amendment passed the Senate by a vote of 56 to 25. 82% of Republicans voted in favor of the amendment, while only 41% of their Democrat colleagues concurred. The very next year, in March of 1920, 36 states ratified the 19th Amendment, and the infighting within state legislatures was steadily approaching a crescendo. Many Democrat-controlled legislatures opposed ratification, and out of those 36 states that ratified, 26 were Republican. Following ratification, over 8 million women voted in the November presidential election that same year, and a 26.2% point victory was awarded to Warren G. Harding, a Republican who was a staunch advocate for women's suffrage. Men throughout this decade experienced great technological and economic achievements, followed by great frustration in the political landscape and grief of war. Our nation was still far from achieving equality, but many strides were made by the men in power in securing a more perfect union during these 10 years. War and the arguments over women's rights caused increased tensions among the sexes. While this video has focused on men in the 1910s, Part 2 is next and will focus on what being a woman was like in 1910s America. I hope you enjoyed this history coffee break with me. This is the first of what I hope to become a series exploring previous decades in our country. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you in the next one.